Hello and welcome to episode 12 of the Yoga Meets Movement Science podcast. In this episode, we will be talking about restorative yoga versus stretching. So, when we think about yoga in general, oftentimes we do yoga for its de-stressing benefits. And in particular, restorative yoga is commonly believed to be very much de-stressing. And so we wanted to take a critical look at that from a research lens and see what the research really has to say about the de-stressing benefits of restorative yoga. And so what we found from one study might surprise you. The study is a 2014 one. It was a randomized controlled trial called The Effect of Restorative Yoga versus Stretching on Diurnal Cortisol Dynamics and Psychosocial Outcomes in Individuals with Metabolic Syndrome. And we'll break that down a little bit more. But the idea with this is that, well, for one thing, Jenni posted about this on social media a couple weeks ago, and it drummed up some interest from people. And maybe made people jump to conclusions a little bit about what we could logically conclude from the research. And so we wanted to take this opportunity not only to think about what we are doing and why we're doing it from a yoga standpoint, and especially a restorative yoga standpoint, but also to critically appraise the study and figure out what we can reasonably conclude based on the design of the study, what the research did, how they did it, and what the limitations of that study were. So just to be mindful that you can't just read the abstract or the conclusion in the abstract and then say, well, restorative yoga is useless or anything of the sort just from one study. So that's why we're here. Jenni, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think you really put that so perfectly. But I definitely noticed in many of the responses to the social media post about this study that and I understand, I know I have these tendencies too, but it's just really easy to want to jump to conclusions and just about from what one study might suggest and then want to apply that more broadly than is maybe necessarily justified. So it definitely seemed that people were like, I always knew that restorative didn't really de-stress, or, it's just like, that affirms what I wanted to believe anyway. And we just, right?
You have
It's
to be
just
careful with that.
a,
If you go in with some preconceived notion and then the study supports that, you're going to be more likely to jump on board with that study. But if you think, oh, I love restorative yoga, I find it so de-stressing, and so do my students, and then the study doesn't show that, then you're going to be more likely to try to pick out all the flaws.
that's
So we
right.
have to be careful of that and notice when try to stop ourselves in our tracks when we're doing either of those, and just try to take an unbiased look, whether the study
Absolutely.
agrees with what we thought going into it or not.
That's right. And I feel like you personally are really good at that, as just being such a
Thanks.
developed scientist and research-based approach and I really feel like I benefited and learned from you in that regard. Like I
I
just know how easy it is to want to act on our biases. And I feel
Yeah.
like you really don't do that. Or
I
you try
like
not to.
I try to be both skeptical and open-minded.
Right. I like that
Yeah.
combination. And I strive to be like that as well.
You
The
do a
more I
nice job
look
of it too.
Well, thank you. I feel like the more that I look at and become a little more familiar with research and how it works, the more I'm able to embody
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. You're not going to, the first time or many times you read research, you're not going to have that really critical lens.
That's right.
You have to develop it over a long
Yeah.
time. I've been doing this for
How many
6,
years?
7, 8 years, starting with my master's degree.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and people who've been doing it for longer are even better at it than I am, right? So
Totally. Yeah. So hopefully this can be a nice lesson, just for like a helpful education for our listeners in just how to maybe think a little more critically and how to take a look at
yeah,
research.
yeah,
Before we actually dive right into the study, we did want to kind of just offer a little bit of background on some of the topics that the study discusses and what are pertinent to even looking at the study and what they looked at.
yeah,
And probably the first is to just define just in case anyone doesn't really know, to define what restorative yoga is. Hey, Travis, have you ever taken a restorative yoga class?
I
I
have
just wondered.
not.
I kind of thought you might not have.
Yeah.
I have
Well,
a
wait a
few.
second.
Yeah.
I did take one class. I might have talked about this on the podcast before. I think I've told you before. I took one class that I didn't know what it was, and I went in, and long story short, we held like 6 poses. We did like 6 poses
Mm-hmm.
throughout the class, and maybe held each one for 10 minutes. And I just thought that we were warming up.
The whole time. That's
And then
right.
finally, maybe 40 minutes in, I realized, okay, this isn't what I thought it was. This is
That's.
just
I remember.
so. But
Yes.
we didn't have the props that I think are
Mm-hmm.
really characteristic of
Of what
restorative.
restorative really is.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I don't know if there's another type that
Um.
maybe doesn't use the props but also does long sustained holds,
I know that's
or
hard for me. I mean, I know Iyengar yoga tends to be like a smaller number of poses held for a longer amount of time, although it tends to also incorporate a lot of prop usage.
yeah.
But it's more active than what restorative yoga really
Yeah, we
is.
probably had blocks, but I don't think that in that studio we had bolsters at all.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe
And
we had
both
blankets, but
bolsters, blankets, blocks, straps, eye pillows, all of those are really common props
yeah.
used in restorative yoga. Restorative yoga is a style that was originally created by BKS Iyengar, one of the grandfathers of modern postural yoga. So it comes out of his lineage, and it's definitely a really widespread type of yoga. You could loosely call it like gentle yoga, but it's not really even just gentle yoga, because gentle yoga could just be really slow, very low load movements, stretches. But restorative is really something specific where you prop yourself up, like on bolsters and blankets, and then you lie back on these props that are soft and supportive. And then you really just, and you often put an eye pillow over your eyes. You don't have to, but it's really about like embodying the shape and resting back on those props so that they fully support you. So you get this sensation of a full release. I know is this word that we've talked about on the
How
podcast
dare
before.
you?
I know to use the word release right now, but I think in this context, I think most people kind of make sense. Like you're just really like letting go, whether that's muscular effort wise, whether that's holding on to your thoughts wise, it's kind of all of it. And you just let the props support you. And like you said, the poses are held like 10 to 15 minutes often. Sometimes it's shorter than that, but in
It
a
seems
true.
very meditative in nature from what I read of acknowledging your thoughts and letting them pass without judgment. Um,
That's
and
right.
that's not a cue that you're told during vinyasa flow class, right?
Right. I think it can be, but it can also just be harder to focus on that.
Yeah, you're just doing a
You're
lot.
doing so much, right? So much movement. Yeah. Yeah. So I do find sometimes that language is peppered through more active class, but certainly in restorative, which is these longer held, very passive postures, a focus could be set on that more. But of course, there are other contexts of like mindfulness practices, like a seated meditation, in which that's like really truly the focus. But then you're in an upright seat and it's not this full relax. So there are really all these different ways that types of practices like these can manifest. But
Right.
yeah. So do you think that's a pretty good laying of the land of what restorative yoga is about? And generally, most people do it with the goal of relaxing, like relaxing, restoring, de-stressing,
Yeah.
letting go of
I
stress.
maybe as a quick aside, you can differentiate it from yin yoga because
Thanks for bringing that
maybe I'm the
up.
only dum who gets
No,
them
you're not.
confused, but
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, so that's a great question. Yin yoga and restorative, they are both passive practices, but restorative has all those props, and you generally just like lie on the props and release. Using that word again. Yin is more. I do think sometimes yin teachers will use props, but traditional yin is no props, and it's still long held postures, and it's just these passive, I would say, unsupported stretches, meaning like no props. And you like say it's a seated forward fold, like say you're sitting with your legs straight out in front, and then you fold forward. That would be Paschimottanasana in most forms of yoga. And you would literally just kind of slump over your legs and hold that position for 5 to 10 minutes. And then it's really about this like intense stretch sensation and kind of mediating that stretch sensation and maybe being one with that. Whereas to contrast that with
I
restorative,
see.
it's often not so much about that intense stretch. I mean, you might come into a bit of stretch sensation, but just a bit. And it's not really about that. It's more about the relaxation.
I'm gonna remember it from now on.
You're good. Yeah. Yeah. That
I
does
got
that.
it.
Okay.
Yeah. It finally clicked for me in
Yeah,
this
but
moment.
for sure, a lot of people lump those two together in their minds, or when they're talking about like the more gentle styles of yoga, it's like yin and restorative, but they're actually they're quite distinct in
Right.
that
So they're
sense.
but the common theme is long held poses, but one is really geared towards relaxation and one is really geared towards stretching.
Yeah,
And the use of props differs.
that's
So it's
right.
the intention is much different.
Yeah, I think yin is kind of it's more like intense in a way. It's like that intensity as far as stretching and feeling the
Hmm.
stretch. Whereas in restorative, it's like you don't want that intense. Like you almost don't want to feel the stretch so that you can just really like tune out. I don't know if
Right.
tune
And that's
out's the
what the
best.
props are. You're
Mhm.
arranging the props in such a way to
Precisely.
allow for that relaxation of muscle tension,
Yeah,
which
exactly.
you're
Yeah,
doing the opposite when you're trying to get into a deep forward fold.
exactly. So, yeah, I think that's really good to outline that difference for our listeners because some people also might not really know the difference between those two. So, if restorative yoga, if one of the main focuses is to truly let go and like quote unquote de-stress, that does kind of bring us to the topic of stress in general and what's known as the stress response. Travis, do you know what the stress response is, like biologically in the human body?
Well, I believe it's the release of hormones signaling the fight or flight response, right? So when
Yeah.
you're encountering a potentially dangerous situation, the fight or flight response is a favorable biological process that upregulates your hormones to prepare you to act, whether
Hmm.
it's to fight or flight.
Right.
So engage or run away, and that's like a evolutionary thing, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Maybe nowadays we're not like confronted with the bear in the forest, but
That's
we are
right.
still confronted with situations where we have to take action in a certain way. So that response is favorable and necessary in situations. But if our nervous system is chronically in
Hmm.
that fight or flight mode,
Hmm.
um, too much autonomic
Yeah.
activity of the
Of the
nervous system as of the
sympathetic nervous
sympathetic
system.
system as opposed to the parasympathetic system,
Hmm.
then we can get into trouble from a stress standpoint, where that would be the if we're always in that fight or flight mode or constantly or too much, then that is the tantamount to saying we're chronically stressed.
That's right. Exactly. And it's like our modern Western society kind of lends itself to things like chronic stress developing because, like you said, we're not really in a context very often where we're chased by a bear, but we do have potentially just like work stresses, relationship stress, like these kind of it's different, but things come up for us in a more kind of everyday context, and it's how we respond to those things that and sometimes we can train that response, which is what something like restorative yoga, what that might be beneficial for, or what people think is to helps train and regulate the stress response in maybe a healthy manner, because sometimes it can become a little dysregulated where, like you said, it leads to just this low level of kind of chronic stress, which isn't really it's not really what that part, like how the nervous system works. It's not really how it evolved to work, to just be kind of at a low level on all the time in response to all these little things that happen maybe all day long and in our everyday interactions. It's more just like, I see a bear, I need to ramp it up and get out of here, or I need to freeze. Or sometimes fight or flight is how I usually hear it described, but I've also heard the term fight, flight, or freeze, because freeze is just another, I guess, biological strategy that a creature might use in a situation like that. It's just to hold
I
still.
think depending on the type of bear, sometimes you're
Oh
supposed to
yeah,
just stay still, right?
that's Yeah, you're taught that like if you're hiking or something, right?
But
Like don't
there's
run.
one of the types of bears you're supposed to like get big and try to scare
Right.
them, and then one of them you're just supposed to
Hold
stay
really
still. But
still.
don't come to this podcast for uh,
For advice.
advice on outdoor.
Oh
That's
my
just not my
gosh. We don't
forte.
specialize in that, right?
No.
But we do like to talk about the nervous system and nervous system responses. So, yeah. So, chronic stress, this low level of the sympathetic nervous system kind of being activated at a low level all the time. And that can lead to health problems. That chronic stress can lead to really a wide plethora of health problems, such as high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, some types of cancers, cognitive or mental health issues such as depression, anxiety, PTSD. It's really like a whole host of issues that chronic stress can lead to.
Yeah.
And
Not that it's going to guarantee, but it may
mhm,
increase your risk
that's right. Yeah, exactly. Not that
in
it,
combination with other lifestyle and
right.
genetic, all those things.
That's a really good point. Chronic stress is like one factor, but of course it's all multifactorial, right? Um, yeah. Oh, and another thing I thought is really interesting to point out is that when we exercise our body or when we move like in a structured way, the sympathetic nervous system is upregulated during those times. Like we actually go into fight or flight response when we're exercising, and that's actually good and healthy. And research is actually really conclusively shown that people who are more physically fit, like more they exercise on a more regular basis, they actually have healthier levels, just in a chronic sense. They have healthier levels of response to stressors in their life, meaning that stress response is regulated in a healthier manner. People who are more physically fit. So it's like those doses of the sympathetic nervous system upregulation during exercise can actually help create that just when you're not exercising in daily life,
Right. So it's it's not
healthier.
to say that the going into fight or flight is bad
Mm-hmm.
and we want to avoid it at all costs, and so we should only do gentle styles of
That's right. That's
exercise
right.
where the types of yoga we've been mentioning are the only things that we should be doing. It's about the
Mm,
balance.
that's a really good point. Yeah, so an active style of yoga like vinyasa flow or power yoga, those could also contribute to like healthy stress regulation, but not necessarily by that same means that restorative yoga might. Like one is the more let's upregulate so that we can modulate things better when we're off the mat, and then one is like let's super down regulate, which is the restorative yoga side. So I think that's really interesting too. So this study that we're looking at today, it was looking at stress and it was looking at restorative yoga. And it was like a sub study that was part of a larger study that was looking at restorative yoga's possible effects on something called metabolic syndrome. And metabolic syndrome is it's this cluster of 3 of 5 potential factors that can predispose someone to developing metabolic disease like diabetes and also cardiovascular diseases. So there are, I guess I'll say the 5 potential factors because I think it's interesting just from like a body learning standpoint. And technically, if someone were to have 3 of these 5, then they are considered as having metabolic syndrome, which means they're more likely to develop something like diabetes or cardiovascular disease. So, factor number one is abdominal obesity. Number 2 is high blood pressure. Number 3 is high blood sugar or insulin resistance. Number 4 is high serum triglycerides, which is like a high level of fatty molecules in the blood. And then the 5th factor is this one's kind of long, low serum high density lipoproteins, which basically what I learned is that's just good cholesterol. And you want that kind of cholesterol in your body. So when people have low levels of that good cholesterol, that can be bad. So if someone were to have 3 of those 5 factors, then they're considered as having metabolic syndrome. And that's important in our discussion today, just because that's like what this study was kind of revolved around.
Yeah, the participants in the study all had metabolic syndrome.
Exactly, right. And so in the main study that was conducted, it was looking at like restorative yoga versus stretching, and potential positive benefits it might have for people with metabolic syndrome, like what effects it might have on those specific 5 factors. But then the researchers also had this sub study within the greater study, and that's really what we're going to be talking about today. And that's where they looked more closely, specifically at the stress response, right?
Yep. So they look, and psychosocial factors as well,
Right.
um, related to stress.
Exactly. So this is kind of like an offshoot looking at the same people and the same interventions, but like what they might tell us about these interventions and their effects on, yeah, on stress, both physiological and psychosocial measures of stress. So yeah, so maybe that can lead us into actually kind of looking at the study a little more closely, the
Mm-hmm,
study
mm-hmm.
itself. So what did they do? Like in a really broad
Yeah,
sense.
they did a randomized controlled trial, which means that they took a group of people. In this case, they were all people with metabolic syndrome. They included people anywhere from 21 to 65 years old, and in the end, the average age of the participants was 55 plus or
Hmm.
minus 7. So we don't know the exact range of people, but you can get a sense of they had mostly people who were in their 40s, 50s, 60s.
Hmm.
Um, about 7 in 10 of the participants were women, and about 2/3 of the participants were white. So only
Hmm.
a little over a third were minorities. And then um, they take this group of people. In this case, they started with 170. Yeah,
Yeah.
171 at baseline.
Yeah.
And they measured people on their cortisol levels, so in their saliva,
Hmm.
and they also had them do these psychosocial outcome measures. So they basically took a bunch of different surveys on stress and life events and that sort of thing. I forget how many they did, but they did a bunch.
Hmm.
And then after the measurement, they randomly allocated them to one of two groups: the restorative yoga group or the stretching group. And the both of the interventions were done twice a week for the first 12 weeks of the intervention was 6 months long.
Hmm.
Well, the intervention was 12 months long.
That's right. A
The
year.
first
Yeah.
Yeah, the first 12 weeks were twice weekly 90-minute classes, either of restorative yoga or stretching. And then
Hmm.
from weeks 12 to 24, they just did once a week. And then for or for the next 6 months, they did one class a month. And so they measured the people at baseline, at 6 months, and at 1 year. And so
Hmm.
the 6 month time point, they were really saying this is the post intervention. And then the 12 month, they were saying like this is the maintenance, um,
Right.
because they had faded the number of practices that they were having the people do.
And Travis, didn't they also suggest at least that the subjects practice at home, like do the practices at
Yeah.
home in addition to
Yes.
the
So
in-person classes?
they were recommended to do their own home practice for 30 minutes a day. Kind of vague.
Yeah. It seemed
Um,
vague. Yeah.
they were given a diary to track that, and it seems like the researchers loosely kept tabs on that, but it wasn't very clear to us
Yeah. Yeah.
how they did that. And that's an important thing to note. We'll talk about that when we get to the results as far as their adherence goes.
Perfect.
Um, so yeah, the random allocation. Let me backtrack a little bit. The randomized controlled trial means that the participants are randomly allocated into one of the two groups, the restorative yoga or the stretching. And so that is what the random allocation does is it makes sure, or it attempts to make the groups equivalent at baseline on all of the potential things that could uh, confound the study. So, for example, if you just took the first, if there are 171 people, the first 85 people that came in and said you're going to do restorative, and then the next
Hmm.
86 and said you're going to do stretching, that's not random allocation. and you could, or if you let people pick what group they were going to
Right.
do,
I want to
that
do the
would
yoga
probably be
one.
an even more, yeah, more obvious explanation of this. That might, you might select, there might be systemic or systematic differences between the
Mhm.
people who decide to do yoga and the people who decide to do stretching. And so, for example, you just might wind up with people who are younger doing yoga and
Yeah.
people who are older doing stretching, or more men than women, or there are so many different things that they want to make sure that are equivalent at baseline, because if you have a difference in age, sex, ethnicity, marital status, or even differences in stress levels
Mhm,
between the
mhm.
groups at the beginning,
Right, 'cause they
that
measured
will,
that, yeah.
that could impact the, because maybe people who are older have less stress. I'm just making this up, but and so if one group is older than the other group, and you find a difference in stress at the end, well, you can't say that was due to the intervention. That could have just been due
Right.
to differences
Age.
between the groups. So when you randomly allocate, person one comes in, you flip a coin, say, okay, you're going to go here, you're going to go there, to one group or the other. You hope that in the end, because the groups have, you've randomly distributed all these traits, age, sex, or gender, race, marital status, college education, BMI, body mass index, all these things, that you hope that in the end, when you compare the groups at the beginning, maybe not in the end, after you've randomly allocated, when you compare the groups, you hope that there are no differences in any of those measures that could affect the end result.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
so they were largely successful in that, although they did find that there were differences in marital status, BMI, and use of antidepressants in
Between the 2 groups.
between the two groups. And so that's just like an unfortunate statistical thing that happened, where there were many, many things that they were hoping would be equivalent between the groups. And when you have enough things that you're looking at, there's bound to, just by chance, be a difference between a couple of them.
Mhm,
And so in this case, there were, um, which is maybe especially problematic for the BMI, given that
mhm.
they were looking at people with metabolic disease. The difference in BMI was about 4, which is not a small. So 36 in the restorative group compared to 32. They were all obese, but the restorative group was quite a bit more
Mhm,
on average.
mhm.
But so what they ended up doing was they controlled for that statistically. It's just a
Right.
procedure for, okay, these groups were different on these variables, so we have to include these variables in our statistical analysis. So it's an imperfect solution, but it does correct for it, at least in part. So they randomly allocated. They took their measures at the 6-month point, at the 1 year point, and I guess we can just get a little bit more into the or the
Mhm,
interventions. So
mhm.
we mentioned there were 90-minute classes. The restorative class was very much what we described restorative yoga to be, right?
That's right.
Um, I don't think that there's anything strange or
No, there was
unique
nothing
about what they did.
different. No, it
It
just seemed very
sounded,
very
yeah,
average.
yeah, it sounded like what you would expect a
Like
restorative
classic
practice to be.
restorative, yeah, all the props, held for a long time. I think eye pillows, I think
Yeah,
over eyes.
I
Yeah?
believe that's true.
Yeah.
And then the stretching group did what you would generally consider to be stretching. They held stretches for 30 seconds, they repeated them 3 times. There was a total of, I think, 27 stretches that they did in sitting and standing. The reason that they did them in sitting and standing was try to make it as different from
Mhm,
the like recline, or the lying on your back
mhm.
poses that they would do in the
In
yoga
restorative.
intervention. They described the position as inversions. Do you think that means prone? So they said, to induce this relaxation response, we did they did reclined stretches, or hold on here, where are we? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I'm trying to look it up too because I think I know what you're
It's, they probably did them on their back and on their stomach,
I
or
th
is
I think I was assuming when they said inversions, they meant, Like, for example, supported bridge pose. You lie on your back and you put like a bolster underneath your hips. So that's technically an inversion. It doesn't seem like it, but your hips are higher than your heart. So that could be considered an
Oh, okay.
inversion.
So pretty much then everything is on your back.
In the restorative yoga,
Yeah.
I think so. I'd have to remind myself what the actual poses were that they
Actually, they
did.
did. Yeah, they did list them. Okay, so supported reclining pose, which you just described, forward bend with head on chair. So that's a
Yeah,
seat.
that I think that's a seated forward fold, and then they have their head on the chair, I think.
Okay. Baby bridge pose.
That's probably the supported bridge pose that I described.
Reclining pose with legs on chair. Okay, I can do that
So that
one.
would be an inversion right there. That would be an inversion.
Yeah, and then final relaxation.
So by
Okay.
inversion, I think they mean they're talking about these gentle inversions. Like we
Yeah.
might think of handstand and headstand as an inversion, and they are, but you can also do very gentle inversions. And
So
that's yeah.
yeah, anyway, the stretching was sitting and standing. So to try to make those as different as possible because they were trying not to induce that relaxation response that we're really seeking with the yoga intervention. So that was the difference between these two things. We know that stretching has some benefits, and we're trying to tease when we compare these two groups. We're trying to tease out the relaxation from whatever physical practice of moving and stretching that we're getting from stretching. So I
Totally.
guess we can speak to that. I thought that maybe they should have also included. Well, let me backtrack. They did a nice job with this. They had a lot of people, so
Hmm.
171
Right,
people
that's a pretty good.
is a decent sample size.
Yeah.
Although they didn't really, at least in this sub study, they didn't really justify why that was the number of people, which is would have been
Um,
better to say this was as many people as we needed for these reasons.
right, right.
Maybe they spoke to that in the other study, but anyway, they had a decent number of people. They did a really rigorous intervention. They collected the data. The planning of the intervention was good. The execution of the intervention seems good. The collection of the saliva
Hmm.
um, samples seemed very rigorous.
Hmm.
Uh, and so there was a lot of good. However, I thought that they probably should have included a control group that did nothing,
Hmm.
because you so with this study design they can compare the two, this intervention versus the other intervention, but they can't compare to just what happens over 6 or 12 months from just doing nothing to these people, which
Right.
is an important thing to know. Like what's the natural progression of this over that time so that you can, because maybe people just tend to get better.
Anyway,
these values, their stress and their the saliva measurement of cortisol and their stress just changes over time as a result of being in a study and having it measured. And so we don't really know that, we just know the
that makes
comparison of the
sense.
two
Thank you
groups.
for explaining that. Yeah, and why a control group is important, and thank you for explaining earlier why randomization is important. These seem like just good lessons for people to learn when they're thinking about research in general.
Yeah, so it's really hard to do a study like this, and so I mention that because we're gonna mention other
Right.
limitations or design, like things that we're gonna critique moving forward. But I want to point out that the this is pretty well done research, at least on in certain respects. So it's not just that this is trash and
Right. Like
we
this is a
should
bad
throw
study.
this out. Yeah, this was a nice study, and every study has methodological
Hmm.
has limitations based on the methodology. There's
Right.
no perfect study. So
Can I ask you just a random question?
mhm.
You were mentioning how there's no control group, and that you think that would have made a stronger study. But and this is a randomized controlled trial. It's in our. So I was just wondering, like, why they would how it can be an RCT, a randomized control trial, and
the
not have a control group.
I
Can
think
you do
that the
that?
control group was the stretching. I think that
Oh, that's what they consider the.
Yeah. So usually a randomized controlled trial would have an intervention group and a control group, but the control group it could be something as simple as they do nothing for the period
Hmm.
of time of the intervention, or it could be what was called would be called like usual care.
Oh, right. Usual
And
care. Right.
yeah, but in this case, it was a it was a stretching intervention. It wasn't just a control group, but
Right.
so they use that term somewhat loosely, I suppose. You also hear so randomized controlled trial, RCT, is sometimes called a randomized clinical trial. A clinical
Uh-huh.
trial is usually like a drug trial. So
Mm-hmm.
there, you sometimes use these words interchangeably,
Mm-hmm.
um, so that yeah,
Good to keep that in mind as well.
yeah, good to keep that in mind, because if you read that, oh, it was a randomized controlled trial, so there must have been a control group. In this
Right.
case, the control group was, I
The
think
stretching
it was
group.
the stretching group.
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks for
That's how they were
explaining that.
considering it. Yeah. So let's see. We talked about the intervention. We talked about so what they were trying to do was compare this the cortisol in the saliva and the psychosocial stress outcomes
Mm-hmm.
from the beginning to the 6 month point and the 12 month point between the two groups to
That's right.
see. And what they hypothesized was that the restorative group would have greater decreases in cortisol
Mm-hmm.
than the stretching group at both time points, at 6 months and at 12 months, and they would have reduced stress as reported on those outcome measures at both time points.
So they basically thought restorative yoga would be more effective as far as these markers of stress. Basically, that they thought it would be more de-stressing in like casual terms. That restorative yoga would be versus just quote just stretching.
Yeah, and the reason that they picked this population was because people with metabolic syndrome may have heightened or elevated
Mm.
levels of stress and
Mm-hmm.
cortisol, and so these types of interventions could be beneficial for them.
Right. That's like why it's pertinent.
Yeah. So, that also speaks to something important that we have to keep in mind with this, is that because the study was done on people with metabolic syndrome,
Mm-hmm.
we should be careful in extrapolating those results to other
Yeah.
populations, of whether it's people who don't have metabolic syndrome or whether it's males, because this
Oh,
was
right.
mostly
Mostly
females,
females.
whether it is ethnic minorities, because this was
Mm-hmm.
mostly not, or younger people or older people than
Yeah.
55 plus or minus 7. So
Right.
just the study applies most specifically to that
Mm-hmm.
particular demographic, and as you get further from that demographic, you should be uh, more cautious in your
Mm-hmm.
confidence in extrapolating those results. So that's really important, right?
Yeah. In
As we'll
general,
talk
right? Like
about,
with
like,
looking.
yeah, anytime we talk about research, but in specifically regards to this and their findings on restorative yoga, to be able to then extrapolate it outside of people with metabolic syndrome is a
Mm-hmm.
stretch,
Mm-hmm.
or it's just, you
A
would have to
stretch.
do the study. Yeah, a
Sorry,
stretch.
just the pun.
Yeah, you would have to do the study or repeat the study on people who don't have metabolic
Like
syndrome to really be confident in saying these findings apply to people who don't have
that's
metabolic syndrome.
right.
But the metabolic syndrome, it makes sense why they looked at this, because this is an important population for trying to get those stress levels down, and they might, you would think they would probably be a responsive group because they are stressed.
Uh-huh.
So
Because they're all
if
right.
there is a lot
Right.
of stress on board, then you can try to mitigate that. Although I think that they found that these people had lower stress than they
Cortisol. I think they had
expected
lower
them to.
cortisol levels like
Yeah.
upon waking in the morning.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I don't have
I
any
don't really,
explanation for
yeah,
that.
I don't either. But they did mention that in the study.
Yeah. So anyway, do you want to tell us what they found?
Yeah. Yeah. So we laid out what they hypothesized, what they thought they would find. But contrary to what they thought they would find, they found that the stretching group did better. It did better on both the cortisol levels and on their perceived stress levels, like the
Yeah,
psychosocial measures of their
one
stress.
measure of that.
Right,
That's
because like you said, they looked at many different factors or yeah, when it came to
mhm.
that. But yeah, they found that basically that the stretching group outperformed the restorative group as far as I mean, you could in just a general sense, as far as markers of stress, that it seemed that the stretching intervention was more effective than the restorative yoga intervention, which surprised the researchers. And I feel like that would surprise just many people who practice, learn about, know about restorative yoga and its purported benefits, like what it's all about. So that's what they found, and it was definitely surprising. But they analyzed all the statistics, and it does seem to be that that is what their data showed.
Yeah, I think
Uh,
that's fair to say.
okay, yeah, but of course we're gonna break that down a little bit.
Hmm.
But I think that's something that's very important to point out is that the researchers also pointed out in the discussion section of this paper that so they were super surprised by this, but one possible explanation that they speculated could be playing a role was the fact that the stretching group had more social interaction during the classes. So the students interacted with one another more.
They talked.
Apparently, yeah, they talked, right? Is that what you said? They
Hmm.
talked. Yeah, they talked with each other more. Apparently, there were discussion topics that the groups were led through, that the group was led through. And additionally, they mentioned that the stretches that they did in the active stretching group, they changed like every 30 seconds. So they would like do a stretch for 30 seconds and then they would do another stretch. So there was just more movement in general. And they speculated that but especially that social interaction aspect may have been what really played the role as far as the stretching group doing better. Because social interaction, social support, social connection is actually a known factor that can really make people feel more supported and less stressed in general. And so that was what they speculated. And Travis, didn't they even retroactively go back and reanalyze with that in mind to see if the social connection was playing a role?
Yeah, so they weren't really planning on looking at that, um,
Right. They didn't set
but
out to investigate that.
yeah, that wasn't one of their primary objectives. But then after the fact, when they found that the stretching group had this reduction more favorably in stress and cortisol compared to the restorative group, they looked to see if they could tease out why that was happening based on the
Hmm.
data that they had already collected. So they ran some correlations and found that the people there was a relationship between the sense of belonging and
Right. That's what they
the
said.
reduction in stress. So if you were designing a study ahead of time and you were trying to tease that out, then you would do that in a particular way with that particular
Right.
objective. This was kind of let's just see if we can, based on the data that we have, let's see if we can explain why this was the finding.
Right. Right. I pulled a quote to read that they wrote about this from the study, which says, because I think this is super interesting for us as yoga practitioners. They wrote, even though restorative yoga is often carried out in a group setting, so just pointing out the restorative classes were group classes. But back to what they wrote. The focus is on relaxation of the individual, with the body fully supported by yoga props such as blankets and bolsters. Poses are held for extended periods of time, 10 to 15 minutes, and communication between participants is minimal. And all of that to me seems to describe a restorative yoga class really well. And so just kind of pointing out, I mean, maybe when you come into the class and maybe when you leave at the end, maybe there's some social interaction, maybe, but it's not a type, it's not a type of setting where people are really interacting with each other. And then the researchers after that, they just wrote in the stretching intervention, the group conversed with weekly discussion topics and stretching poses changed approximately every 30 seconds. It is possible that the increased social interaction or the physical movement associated with the stretching intervention led to our observed outcomes. So I do think that's interesting. I think we know from a lot of other research just how important and how powerful social connection can be. And I think we've talked, Travis, you and I have talked about the study that it's potentially like it's a problem that the stretching group did incorporate so much of the social interaction because necessarily a part of a restorative practice. And then it's like you're comparing two different,
Yeah, it's a bit
like they're
apples
two
and
different, right?
oranges. You'd
Yeah.
rather maybe see stretching where they're just a stretching intervention where there just wasn't a lot of dialogue
Mm-hmm.
going on between
Mm-hmm.
people, um, as a more one-to-one comparison from a physical standpoint. The one thing that
Mm-hmm.
I thought maybe this could influence us from a practitioner standpoint is, okay, the if there is something to this sense of belonging and these social
Mm-hmm.
dynamics that are taking place in the stretching class, can we recreate those in our yoga classes? Probably not during the yoga class, especially not during a restorative class,
Right.
but before and
Before and
after.
after.
Because
Yeah.
I know, like, one thing we've looked into a lot with the online yoga thing is that
Mm-hmm.
there's often some discussion that's occurring before or after in a really positive way that may, like, group discussion that may not have been occurring in a live setting.
In person.
Yeah,
Yeah.
just because people go up to the teacher after class and they'll chat, but it's
Like a
not the same as
collective.
everybody in their squares on Zoom having a conversation. And so people report that they like that. And so maybe introducing that in some way but either before or after your restorative class could bridge that gap of, okay, we can't talk, this is just not, this practice doesn't
Right.
lend
It's
itself
like
to
not
that.
the practice.
That's not
Yeah.
what it's for. But can we create some of that before or after?
I think that's a really good point. And if, yeah, people did want to apply like some aspects of what the study might suggest, that could be a practical way to do so. It's also not to say that social interaction is the only way that people can alleviate stress. Like obviously, we know there are all these other practices and things we can do that have a positive effect on stress levels. But knowing that social interaction is so great and that sense of belonging can be so helpful. And when you have a yoga class, it is a group of people. So if a teacher is interested in kind of helping to convey these benefits, then maybe, yeah. And I totally agree with you. I personally, I think if I were in a yoga class and in the middle of the class we were all talking to each other, that just, to me, that wouldn't be my personal preferred way of practicing yoga. That's not so much like what it's about for me, but absolutely beginning and end, having a little more opportunity for more group interaction or feeling part of like the collective. That seems like that could be really supportive in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
And good point too about how our research into the online yoga, which we should link that in the show notes because that was this really interesting survey that we did a few months after the pandemic hit, where we surveyed yoga practitioners and just like had really great comparisons between people's opinions about like online yoga compared to in-person yoga.
Yeah. I think people were concerned that they would lose out on
Hmm.
the community aspect of it. And some of them found was that it was actually even better
Yeah.
online, or
Be-
maybe different and equivalent at worst.
right.
It's obviously a different type of community, but they were still able to get some of that benefit in that way.
Absolutely, because in a Zoom class, you have that beginning part where, like you said, everyone's in that square and the teacher's kind of welcoming everyone. And it actually, I know it's online and it's on a screen and it's different, but it's actually maybe more of that group connection sense where everyone is really looking at everyone else and holding attention in this way that's actually different than a yoga in-person class where everyone's looking at the
Yeah,
teacher.
you sit down and on your mat and do whatever
Hmm.
you're doing. Everybody's facing forward, kind of
Hmm.
waiting for the teacher to start class.
So that's like more between you and the teacher versus you and everybody else. Whereas Zoom classes actually kind of counterintuitively they incorporate that. So that'd be an interesting maybe research to be done on that, just like that element of it. But anyway, so yes, that could be a really nice takeaway. I think a helpful takeaway for people from this. Um, what else about this study, Travis?
I think just a few more limitations to bear in mind as we are tempering our conclusions from this is that I mentioned they started with 170 or 171 people.
Hmm.
And in the end, at 6 months, they lost about 18% of those people. And then by 12 months or 1 year, they had lost 23%. And
Hmm.
they acknowledged that this was problematic, and they also acknowledged that they didn't specifically keep track of why people were dropping out. And I think they tried to a little bit, but they weren't able to reach the people that dropped out. And the rule of thumb that I've seen is maybe 5 to 10% would be expected and normal, and
Of a
um,
dropout, right?
of a dropout rate. Yeah. So if you start with 171, maybe if you wind up with 17 fewer people at the end, like that would be tolerable.
Hmm.
Losing many more people than that, in this case over 20%, is problematic, because you don't know if those people had stuck around, how would they have changed
Hmm.
the outcomes. So it's just a threat to the validity of the findings when you lose so many people.
Yeah.
What else? What other uh, issues did we potentially want to bring up here? Oh, well, so that we briefly touched on this, but just the idea that they did find differences in perceived stress. The two variables that they found differences in at the 1 year mark were perceived stress and life stress assessment. Those are just two measures that they used, but there were other measures that they didn't find differences in. So it wasn't
Right.
like across the board for everything that they measured. All of these different parameters of stress were reduced in the stretching group.
Hmm.
So you just want to keep that in mind. If you look at a lot of different variables, you by
Right.
chance could find something that is statistically significant. But if you look at many variables and most of them are not showing anything and one of them is, then you just have to, it's not to say that the one that's showing a difference isn't true. It just be aware that there were many variables that didn't show a difference.
Right. That seems really important. And for us interested in having like critically thinking minds for us to keep in mind when we're looking at this. If they looked at many different measures of perceived stress and two of them really stood out, that's very interesting. And they can highlight that, but there were all these other measures in which it didn't seem like there was much of a difference.
Mm-hmm.
So, in conclusion, I mean, this study, what this study basically suggests is that if you compare restorative yoga, and for people specifically with metabolic syndrome, comparing a practice of restorative yoga to a group stretching class, which when we posted about this on social media, Travis, I remember that you made sure that when we summarized it, we mentioned it's group stretching plus social interaction. It's not
Yeah.
just group stretching. So like the title of the study is restorative yoga versus stretching, right? Like that's how they kind of summarize it and put it out there. But when you really look at it, it's actually restorative yoga compared to group stretching plus social interaction. So again, like you said, it's kind of apples to oranges. But if you were to compare those two interventions, it appears that the group stretching plus social interaction does better. And just because I think it's interesting and somewhat relevant, the actual main study that this was just a sub study of that was looking at these two interventions on markers of metabolic syndrome, it actually showed that both restorative yoga and group stretching were helpful, but that one wasn't really more helpful than the other. I think they concluded like we can't conclude that restorative yoga is more helpful than stretching for metabolic syndrome. There was one outcome measure where restorative yoga did seem to have a better effect than stretching, but just on the whole, they were both helpful, but they were pretty even. And then when they looked at stress specifically, which was this study, then the stretching did better. So, I mean, that seems like the takeaway here. But as far as people then taking that and just saying, like, see, I knew restorative yoga wasn't worth doing and it wasn't really de-stressing. I mean, I don't think we can say that, right?
No, I wouldn't conclude that. And really, I don't conclude much of anything from, or I don't, from one study, I don't
Right.
say anything is the
Yes.
definitive answer to this. It's just one piece of the puzzle.
100%. And that's a really good, I think, thought to make sure that our listeners kind of take away. It's so easy, I think, to look at what one study may suggest, and then just want to take that and run with it. But
Hmm.
like you said, one study is just one study, right?
Hmm. And I think from a practical standpoint, maybe best thing that you could do would be both.
Right.
So it doesn't have to be in a study. It has to, well, actually they could have had, if they had 1 million people, they could have done a restorative yoga arm of the study, a stretching arm, a restorative plus stretching arm where they did both.
Oh
And
yeah.
inevitably that would have shown the best
Right.
outcomes because they were doing both of them. And then having the control group, the do nothing group.
Mm-hmm.
But in the real world, we can do both. And so,
Mm-hmm.
or we can do multiple styles of yoga that are getting more into
Mm-hmm.
the stretching and not just the relaxation, and try to, and plus the community aspect, we can get all of those benefits. Of course, in a research study where they're trying to tease out one thing versus another thing, they can't just have everybody do everything.
Right, right, exactly. Like that wouldn't be so practical. And in general, if someone loves restorative yoga and if it makes them feel good, if they just subjectively feel better after class, if they love to go to restorative yoga with their friend and they always go together and it gets them out in their social, I mean, all of that is really excellent. This is just like this one study that looked at this one comparison, and it's kind of like we're not really sure how far you can take that comparison. When there's only one study on something, but what is a more powerful suggestion as far as like what science is suggesting? What would be, instead of one study, what would people want to look at?
Yeah, so you would want to look at all the studies.
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm.
so that's not trivial, right? It takes, so first of all, it's, you have to, you can't just look at the abstract. To circle
Right.
back
This
to
is,
what we said at the
yes, what you
very
said in the
beginning,
beginning.
you have to
Mm-hmm.
read the whole study. You have
Well,
to
and
read
the
it with a
abstract.
critical lens.
Can you say what the abstract is really quickly in case
Yeah,
someone
so
doesn't
the
know?
abstract is what shows up, like if you go to PubMed and you find the study, you'll get
Mm-hmm.
like a 250 to 300 word synopsis of just the major take home points about the, what they did, why they did it, what they found, what it means.
Mm-hmm.
But those are just the Cliffs Notes. So if you really want to understand, you have to read the whole thing. And as we found with this, not only
Mm-hmm.
did you have to read the whole thing, but if you really wanted to understand what they did on the whole, you had to pull up their other study that
That's
was
right.
the bigger study, because this was just a sub study. You also would want to pull up their they published the protocol. So before they did the study, they published what they were planning to do. So you'd want to make sure that what they did was actually what they had intended to do. You would also want to maybe pull up some of the background that they
Mm-hmm.
cited. So
Right.
it's this whole thing. Just actually also one other thing, they had some supplemental material, so you could look at all the
I
scales that
downloaded
they
those
used.
actually, or at
Okay,
least
yeah,
the for the restorative yoga and for the stretching. Like
yeah. So
there's
they
these
in the
handbooks.
yeah, in the 12 pages that they published, they can't include everything, like
Mm-hmm.
the laundry list of things that they had people do. So they'll publish that on the online version of it, and you can go and download those Word docs or PDFs and look into those. So that's just pertaining to this study. You would also then want to see, well, what else was done
Mm-hmm.
related to this that maybe they referenced, or what's been done since this, in the 8 years since this. And
Mm-hmm.
so the, like, as the primary scientific literature, and then have there been any review papers or systematic reviews, meta-analyses that took this research and synthesized it with other related research, or just pulled papers together and tried to show, okay, what does the totality of the evidence show on
Right.
this topic. And you're not always going to find, maybe this is the only study that's ever been done looking at this thing, or maybe there are 12 other ones that have been done since. So those are the steps that you would do in conjunction or after reading just this one, if you
Mm-hmm.
really wanted to answer the question of is restorative yoga better or worse than stretching, or is restorative yoga helpful for these people, or is restorative yoga helpful across different populations. You can have a lot of different questions that you might go to the literature for. And so, just like you said, just to walk away from this saying, I knew restorative yoga was a waste,
Which
um,
I yeah.
or to say, well, they had 23% nutrition. This is BS. Restorative yoga
Right.
rocks.
Right,
This
like,
study
just
was
like
just too
right, I'm a
flawed.
restorative yoga
That
teacher, and it makes me
yeah,
uncomfortable to think it might not be so like,
yeah. So just
you're so right.
take it with a grain of salt, but acknowledge what they found, and then
Right.
if you're interested in the topic as a whole, dig deeper.
Like, there's a
And
bigger
it's
story, like,
yeah,
yeah, this is just, like,
but
one sliver of a
yeah,
bigger story.
it's a lengthy process to
It
do all that.
is. My gosh, yeah, I mean, like, how long did it take you to write your dissertation on, like, one topic?
Right, right. Actually, somebody asked me that the other day because I just had the second part of it accepted and published
Oh, that's
online
right.
the other day. Thank you.
Congratulations in the Journal
And
of
then
Athletic Training.
yeah, yeah, and then the first part is like very close to getting formatted in the pretty like print layout. So anyway, they asked me, well, how long did this take you? And I said, well, I did the study for a year, and then I took another year to write it up, and now it's taken 2 more years to actually get it published. So it depends how you count. But and then
Right,
there
right.
were 2 years before that of planning, just for one study. I did it on 37 people. These researchers did it on 171 people. So you can
Right.
imagine the logistical challenges of doing such a large scale study. And so that's why I wanted to say from the beginning, like, yeah, we're going to go through this and we're going to pull out all the things that don't make sense or we're not sure about or why did they do this or whatever.
Mhm.
But hats off to the researchers because it's really, really difficult to do research.
Right. It just seems like a huge undertaking with so many different levels of organization and coordination.
Yeah, and you can always say,
Yeah.
"Well, I think they should have done this and that," but well, what did they do, and why
Yeah.
did they do it, and what did they
And
find?
what's the best that we can take away from that?
Right.
Which, yeah, is going to be far from any sort of solid conclusion, but still interesting and still really good for those of us who have yoga and movement practices and interests to just see what we can take away from this. It certainly makes for a lot of good geeky topics to talk about.
I think so.
Yeah, me too. So with all of that, Travis, do you think we've covered this paper pretty well? And like what
I
our
think
audience might consider. And of course that we'll link to this paper in the show notes. So if anyone wants to look it up,
yeah,
it's a really
it's
interesting.
open access, so
Yeah,
you can
right.
anybody could read it,
And you can also download the supplements to see the exact restorative and group stretch and the stretching practices that they had photos and descriptions. It's just
which is
interesting.
great. That part of it I think
Hmm.
is really important. The just a last little science lesson: the methods of the study should be written in sufficient detail
Mm,
that they could be replicated. And
yes.
so in this case, there was maybe they didn't do the best job of that because they had already written another paper where they had really gone into the methods, so they
Hmm.
refer you to that, and that's okay. But in their supplemental material, they did do a nice job, Jenny's saying, of really laying out what they did from an intervention standpoint. So you could either replicate it or understand what they did, and maybe you're a stretching or restorative yoga expert, and you say that like that's not what I would do, and
Right.
that's fair. And you could argue, well, they should have done this or that, and if they had done that better, then maybe they would have found something different, and so on.
Hmm.
But at least that it's really good that they did provide all of that detail, because if they didn't, then you would just, I don't know exactly what they did.
Right, exactly. And so for our own learning process and understanding, it can be really helpful when they go to the links to really lay everything out like that. I totally agree. Thanks for pointing that out. So, thank you so much for talking about all of this and just offering your insight as far as, being someone who I want to say you like read and think about research like for a living, but you certainly
Yeah,
have, right?
that's the job.
So you have a lot that you can teach and offer us, and I think that you've shared quite a bit in this
Well,
conversation
I
already.
appreciate that. And two different people, or if you got two other yoga
Mhm.
and rehabilitation science, exercise scientists on the call to discuss the paper, they might find different things. And that's why it's useful to have these conversations and discuss it with people with varying expertise and backgrounds, and
Mhm.
they point out different things.
Such a great
So
point.
our interpretation of it is not necessarily the definitive. Well, that it speaks to what the researchers wrote is one thing, how we interpreted it is another
Mhm.
thing, and how somebody else might interpret it, how you might interpret it would be different. Could be different.
So it's always nuanced, right? Like it's just there's always gray area and so much that we can think about and reflect on when it comes to looking at yoga and movement in the body and science, right?
Yeah.
So I just feel really lucky that I got to do that with you. And to our listeners, if you felt like this was a helpful conversation, we'd be curious to hear because this is the first time that we've kind of like looked at a study like this on the podcast. So if you found it helpful and educational, let us know. Or if you have any studies that you know of that you think would be interesting to be looked at. We're
or if you
open.
hated it, let us
Yeah,
know.
yeah. If you didn't like it, let
We'll
us
never
know.
do it again.
Exactly. But yeah, let us know. We certainly like talking about this stuff, but we want it to be informative for you as well. So thank you so much, Travis.
Thanks, Jenni.